Hello students, this is Professor Vicente Sagai. Welcome to my class. This is part 3 of chapter 2 presentation. Chapter 2, Financial Statement, Auditing Environment. In part 2, we left off by talking about organizations that affect the public accounting profession. Here, in part 3, we are going to start off by talking about auditing standards. Question is, what are auditing standards? We said that auditing standards serve as guidelines for and measures of the quality of the auditor's performance. What does that mean? That means two things. In other words, auditing standards, number one, serves as guidelines, meaning we use those guidelines while we are conducting our audit in doing our work. So everything that we do during the process of conducting audit, we have to use the guidelines to conduct our work. And number two, those standards or guidelines also help us to measure the quality of the auditor's performance. What does that mean? So let's assume that you completed an audit as an auditor and somebody decided to sue you for whatever reason. Your defense is following the standards. In other words, if you are able to prove that you follow the standards, then it is likely that you are going to win the case. How? Because the standards help us to measure the quality of the auditor's performance. So if we actually follow the standards from A to Z, then we have actually done our work. So that is one way, or the only way actually, to measure the quality of what we have done. So auditing standards serve as guidelines on one hand. Number two, we also use them to measure the quality of the work that we have done. So now, who is responsible for coming up with these auditing standards or these guidelines? In the United States of America, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, that is the board that came into existence by the time the federal government stepped in regulating our profession. They are responsible for coming up with auditing standards that publicly traded companies have to comply with. So they come up with auditing standards that auditors, that do the audit of public companies have to use in the course of performing their job. Now, in the United States, that's number one. Number two, in the United States, for the non-public companies, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, that body is responsible for coming up with auditing standards that auditors that audit non-public companies follow. Then number three, the IAASB, which stands for International Auditing Assurance Standards Board, is responsible for coming up with the auditing standards that auditors in more than 100 countries, let's back up. More than 100 countries all over the world have agreed to use auditing standards of the International Auditing Assurance Standards Board. So for those countries, they follow those standards. In the United States, we have two sets, PCAOB and the AICPA Auditing Standards Board. So moving along, excuse me for that. Moving along, let's take a look at the 10 generally accepted auditing standards. What the PCAOB did was they piggyback on the AICPA auditing standards. All right, so that was their starting point. But suffice it to say, we have 10 generally accepted auditing standards, and the standards are breaking down into 3 categories. We have the general standards, we have the standards of fieldwork, and we have the standard of reporting. Now let's take a look at the first category. Those are the general standards. Now the general standards, we call them general standards because those standards or guidelines are general in nature. So the first one is adequate technical training and proficiency. What does that mean? Meaning auditors should have adequate technical training and proficiency in performing the audit. So the training is not only technical, but the training has to be adequate, okay? Now, and they have to be proficient in what they do. So that is number 1 of the 3 general standards. Number 2, independence. Independence meaning that the auditor needs to be independent in fact and in appearance, in mental attitude of the auditee that he or she audits. In other words, the auditor has to be independent of the companies that they audit. We are going to talk more about that eventually. This is very critical because without independence, there is no credibility to the work of the auditor. So the third general standard is what we call due professional care, meaning that due professional care must be exercised in conducting audit and also preparing the report thereafter. So those are the 3 general standards. You need to remember the 3 general standards with this mnemonic, and that is a tip. T stands for training, I stands for independence, and P stands for professional due care. So you remember the 3 general standards with TIP. T stands for training, I stands for independence, P stands for professional due care. 1, 2, 3. So that is the general standards, okay? Now, moving along, let's take a look at the second category of generally accepted auditing standards. We call these the standards of fieldwork. There are 3. Number 1, adequate planning and supervised assistance. What does that mean? In other words, the standard or guidelines require auditors to properly plan the audit, because for an audit to be conducted effectively and efficiently, proper planning is necessary. So the standard requires us to plan the audit and supervise our assistants if we have any during the course of doing the audit. Now, let's take a look at the second standard of fieldwork. Obtain sufficient understanding of internal controls, meaning to plan the audit. In other words, the guideline or standard require us to gather or obtain the standard requires us to obtain sufficient understanding of internal control. In other words, for us to plan the audit properly and to be able to determine the nature, timing, and extent of the different type of tests that we need to carry out, then we need to have sufficient understanding of the internal controls of the company that we are auditing. Then the third standard of fieldwork deals with the guidelines require us to obtain sufficient appropriate evidential matter. In other words, we are not only to obtain evidence, but the evidence has to be sufficient, the evidence has to be appropriate. So those are the 3 standards of fieldwork. And you remember these three standards with the acronym PIE. P-I-E. P-I-E. P stands for planning. I stands for internal control. And E stands for evidence. So PIE, P-I-E, planning, internal control. E stands for evidence. So you remember the three standards of fieldwork as such. Now let's take a look at the third and the last category. Those are the standards of reporting. Now these standards of reporting, or the guidelines for reporting, number one is gap. Those are 4. 3, 3, 4, total of 10. Gap, the standards, or this standard requires auditors to state in their opinion or report that financial statements were prepared in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. So your report has to indicate that explicitly. Then the next one is disclosures. So the standards require us to make sure that everything that needs to be disclosed is actually disclosed. Then the third one is consistency, meaning that the report, in other words, the report that the auditor is going to provide or issue at the end of the audit should actually state where gap is not applied consistently. In other words, if gap is not applied consistently from year to year, the report should state so. Then the last and the fourth is opinion, meaning that the standard requires auditor to report. In other words, the standard requires us to explicitly state or express opinion, or say that we cannot express opinion if that is the case. In other words, at the end of the day, that is a very important piece of our report. We have to express opinion on the financial statement that we have audited, or we need to indicate that we cannot express an opinion on those financial statements. The reason for not being able to express opinion, we also need to indicate that as well. So you need to remember the standards of reporting as such: A, C, D, O. Now remember this by saying A, closed door open. A, closed door open. A stands for accordance with gap. So remember that. A, in accordance with gap. Close. C, consistency. Consistency. D, disclosure. And O, opinion. So A, closed door open. A, C, D, O. Accordance with gap, consistency, disclosure, opinion. So those are the standards of reporting. So 3, 3, 4 are 10 standards, 10 generally accepted auditing standards. So that would be the conclusion of part 3 of this presentation.